Chair and members of this committee, for inviting me to speak here today on this important issue. I come to you with a background of 2 decades of work as a criminal defense lawyer for indigent people in federal and state courts in Georgia and Illinois. After having taught a misdemeanor and co-taught a death penalty clinic at DePaul University, after having spent 5 years as the head of the Federal Public Defender Office, so Mr. Woods is not the only public defender you'll hear from today. After having spent a number of years during the Obama administration as the executive director of Clemency Project 2014, and from my current position as deputy director of policy in the Justice Division at the ACLU. My comments are my own and not ascribed to my employer. I chose to use the Ahmaud Arbery murder as the lens through which I would give my comments today, because they reflect that murder, and the subsequent actions of the government reflect America's anti-Black bias. I know you asked me to speak on hate crimes, and generally when we think of hate crimes, we think of people perpetrating crimes against another person based on their race. But I submit to you that there is an unbroken line of hate crimes from the treatment of first enslaved persons by America to today. The first space where we see that is this idea that there are spaces designated for Black people. Historically, we saw that with enslaved ancestors through, of course, Jim Crow that mandated separation. But recently, we've seen that in the body of Trayvon Martin being seen to be in the wrong place, Ahmaud Arbery being seen to be in the wrong place, Sandra Bland, Philando Castro, George Floyd. I could continue to name spaces where America continues to be segregated and continues to hold the idea that there are spaces Black people don't belong. The segregation includes housing. It is no coincidence that we have the south side of Los Angeles, that we have the south side of Chicago, that we have Harlem, that we have Detroit. These conclaves of African Americans, and chiefly, although now being gentrified, in poverty-ridden areas, are a result of the redlining that you've heard my colleagues talk about, and other means of directing African Americans to particular places. There continues to be segregation in employment. In my field, in the legal field, there was just a report the other day from my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, where the Coca-Cola company has now abandoned its efforts to fully integrate its cadre of lawyers because there is a dearth of Black lawyers who work in firms. We've seen it in labor-intensive markets, and what that leads to is an inability to move generational wealth forward. And we've also seen it in the Veterans Administration, where employment and loans, for example, were given to white veterans, but not to Black veterans to move generational wealth forward. We see it in education with legacy admissions, with anti-Black bias testing results. And we've seen, as we've heard today, the school to prison pipeline. We see it in health, and the COVID pandemic showed us with great clarity the disparity in health. We've seen it in health in the prison healthcare system, where healthcare is abysmal. The next place where we see this anti-Black bias play out is in the Black body itself. If it is not deemed as valuable or profitable, it is not deemed as worthy. When it has been deemed, the Black body has been deemed valuable in the carceral system, for example, the modern day slavery that so many have talked about, then it's used to profit from private prisons, not unlike our enslaved ancestors' bodies were used for profit before so-called emancipation. And I know that California is called a free state. However, California participated in those fugitive slave laws. California allowed the holders of enslaved people to bring enslaved Africans into California to work during the gold rush. So, despite being described as a free state, it has not been. Black bodies have only been seen valuable for research. The Tuskegee experiment tells us this. There was COVID vaccine testing in Africa. And as a practitioner, I can tell you, as a legal practitioner, I can tell you that there's testing of new medical procedures in our carceral system as well. Also, Black bodies have been silenced. The Black codes have said that we were not allowed to testify in court, as if we are not to be believed. And in fact, in modern day society, even in the face of our complaints about mistreatment by police officers and by governments, and even in the face of video evidence, we still find it difficult to achieve some modicum of justice. We also see the anti-Black crimes against the descendants of Africans in the spirit of impunity. Impunity for Ahmaud Arbery's killers had it not been for the release of a videotape. The killers would not have been charged. Police officers who enjoy qualified immunity. On Tuesday of this week, we just saw the signing of an anti-lynching bill. And we know that between 1882 and 1968, we know of almost 3,500 Black people having been lynched. And so years later, we are just seeing the first bill that would address anti-lynching. And as an aside, in my death penalty work, I can tell you that in America, as lynchings went down, as the counting of lynchings went down, there was an increase of the death penalty use against Black people in America. So our criminal legal system substituted itself in that vigilante justice that we know as lynching. Hate crimes that are investigated by the FBI, while at the same time the FBI having been infiltrated by the hate groups themselves. The Brennan Center reported on the pervasive infiltration among the ranks of law enforcement officers, and particularly in the FBI. This anti-Black bias shows up in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And then, of course, the carceral system has collateral consequences. The disenfranchisement of Black people, the inability to vote or to serve as peers on a jury. The next area that I'd like to just mention to you is the dog whistle, which I see as an anti-Black, or hate crime perpetrated by many members of the American political system and legal system and otherwise. We've talked today about Nixon's aide Ehrlichman, who admitted that the war on drugs was fabricated to disrupt Black communities. We know that the omnibus crime bill that was championed by current President and former President Clinton was dangerous to Black people and has led to the highest number of incarcerated people in the world. We heard former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton call young Black men super predators, and I'm talking about dog whistle here. So while the actual word Black men wasn't uttered, we all know what that meant. And then the use of Willie Horton during a presidential campaign that tanked Massachusetts governor's run for president was a part of the dog whistle. But we see dog whistle also in laws that are passed or reform that is stopped in part due to sort of this rhetoric about rising crime rates. And I would caution you when you think about that rhetoric, because if crime rates can be attributed to the stops that police officers make, and if we know that police officers are more frequently in Black communities, and as you've heard earlier, more frequently arrest people, then the crime rate is being driven by those stops of police officers. And just tangentially, the idea of violent crime, we've seen this idea that violent crime is on the rise as a way to stop reform of our criminal laws. Violent crime, too, is discerned by police officers. A theft, for example, can either be labeled an assault or a theft. If it is labeled an assault, it is a violent crime, and therefore a violent crime is up. So I would caution you to think about that sort of dog whistle when you think about the need for reparation for Black people. In California, the governor has the power to grant clemency in this carceral system. It is a power that he has exercised before, but the executive in California can provide some remedy in the reparations scheme, although I would submit to you that clemency is not something that we should get in reparation. We should get that otherwise. It should be outside of reparation. So in this modern era, we know that Ketanji Brown Jackson, for example, when she was being questioned by the Senate and critical race theory came up, I see that as an anti-Black bias by members of the Senate against her. And so we don't just merely see it in the space of hate crimes that are on the books. Hate crimes abide and abound throughout the systems and have an impact on descendants of African Americans. And those impacts are lasting. You may ask why I'm talking about this when we're talking about the carceral system. And it is because the carceral system is the center of that spoke, of all of the spokes: education, finance, wealth, housing, that have been talked about earlier. So this lasting impact shows up as broken families in our community. You saw some mention of the New York Times study about the ages of people who are mostly in our carceral system. I would submit to you that those folks are not just in the carceral system at the time when they should be working or would otherwise be working. They are there at the time when they would otherwise be procreating and bearing other Black children. So it has an impact, in fact, on whether or not Black people exist or continue to exist. Our communities are under surveillance, and particularly in California, that's how we get so-called high crime areas. This is a lasting impact. I had the pleasure of co-chairing a committee with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers that looked at predictive policing and surveillance. The study is called Garbage In, Gospel Out, that showed that Black people and Black communities are under constant surveillance, and that has an impact on us as a community. It harkens to the COINTELPRO era of surveillance of our people, and currently there's a focus on organizations like Black Lives Matter and similar organizations. It continues to show up in health disparity, in mental health, the trauma that's associated with racism, the transgenerational trauma that's associated with racism. And I don't know about you, but I know my rights. But if I'm pulled over by a police officer, I am traumatized. And I wonder whether I'm going to leave that situation with my life. The physical health is also a lasting impact of structural and systemic inequities in healthcare and health coverage due to not being able to get good jobs that get health coverage, due to doctors not believing our ailments when we report them, or not taking them seriously, or not taking our health seriously. There are some studies that show that there are disparities in health and healthcare among Black people. There are studies that show that there's disparities in finances, in financial literacy and wellness and generational wealth, all lasting impacts for which reparation is needed. We've mentioned education, school readiness, teacher-student ratios, legacy enrollment in colleges, the school-to-prison pipeline. I don't have to tell you that in some schools, if there's a shooting, for example, in school, every healthcare professional in the surrounding area is called to help some students. However, our students can walk through shootings and trauma-induced communities on their way to school, and there's a very different response to their trauma response. And in the political arena, we have currently no Black governors across our nation. This is a lasting impact of systemic racism and anti-Black bias. We've only had 3 Black senators in our federal system, and until 2013, we never had 2 Black senators at the same time. And then lastly, I'll offer to you that our culture continues to suffer with the plunder of African artifacts, the erasure of African achievement, and the forbidding of the practice of African culture. We continue to suffer as we are flung across the diaspora. I thank you for the ability to comment today, and I welcome any questions you have.